So we're going to begin our last lecture of the mass media unit, and it's called Media Regulations. And before we start, you might want to take a moment here to just kind of remember where we've, come from. So our first very opening lecture started with what the role and the function of the media is. We followed up with kind of a history, a timeline, if you will, of what progressive, movements have taken place within the media. And then we talked really significantly about what the impact between the media and the president has been, that relationship. And we really looked at a bunch of different eras in combination with the timeline that we originally spoke about. We touched and briefly highlighted on the relationship between the media and Congress. And then we went even further, talking about what a feeding frenzy is and kind of the hysteria that has sometimes plagued our current media. So for homework, you guys read the second part of the feeding frenzy article, and then you also, hopefully, looked at what the criticisms are. And so this will really be the last and final piece. So, regulations, right? You think regulating, you're thinking control. And interestingly enough, that is where we're going, but it's not. And I think that that'll kind of make more sense as we move forward. So just to recap, we did talk about this in our opening part of the unit, but media ownership is sort of unique in our country. In many countries in the world, the government actually owns the media outlets. And so when we're talking about not just print, broadcast, and internet media, all of our internet media, for the most part, with the exception of something like a PBS or an NPR, is privately owned. And so you can see that that maybe necessarily wasn't the case in the mid-20th century, but really is today. If you look really at most places in the world, it's somewhat rare. Only most democratic nations have that, but certainly our country is kind of top dog, if you will, when it comes to this idea of freedom of the press. So where does it come from? The Telecommunications Competition and Deregulation Act is really the thing that helps to eliminate so many restrictions on media ownership. And it was passed, this act, this law was passed in effect to kind of encourage private media, and in doing so, it really allowed bigger corporations to kind of concentrate themselves and buy up any of the small little groups that maybe existed in the 1950s. And what we have seen since this act was passed was really, for us, we're really only being reached by a few major corporations, and we talked about that at the beginning of the year. So here are some of the concerns. Because it is so unique that our media is privately owned, of course we have to have some concerns, some criticisms behind it. And something like the Telecommunications Competition and Deregulation Act, it actually begins to restrict rather than promote political debate. So while it gives everyone the freedom to enter into this, media outlet corporation-based business venture, because it's the richest people kind of controlling it, they really are restricting what we see, what we hear, and of course what they report. And of course their biggest thing, because they are a corporation, because they are a business, is that they're motivated by money. And so it's up to them to not only meet our needs, but to entertain us. And that's part of our need, is to be entertained. That's kind of the point you watch television. I mean, even if you're watching the 6 o'clock news to be informed, you're also watching it, guys, to get some information, sure, but to get some, entertainment, to learn something, to come away with a story to talk about with your friends. And so because of this, more often than not, okay, the opinions, valuable reporting sort of starts to sink, because people are more concerned with ratings. They're more concerned with making sure that they get their message out, and then of course making sure that they have the viewers that they need. So our next slide, talks a little bit about what choice looks like for us. So I showed you the one on the left, the illusion of choice, and you can, kind of peruse if you need to pause here to really investigate and look at this a little bit more in depth. That's absolutely fine. In fact, I encourage it. So you can see we have these really 6 major media outlets, and then the graphic to the right of that, when you're looking at the screen, the who owns the big TV networks breaks that down even further, and you can see really the who's who, if you will, of these big media corporations. And so, it's important to talk about the idea of private ownership and the idea of these corporations as we segue into a more regulated media. So take 30 seconds of think time and think about, this is really going back to Unit 1 when we really broke down the Constitution bit by bit, what freedoms are granted in the First Amendment. You're going to want to jot these down. So hopefully you came up with this one. This is the big one. Freedom of the press. This is obviously related to media. It is sort of hidden in our First Amendment. Most people remember freedom of speech, freedom, the right to assemble, but sometimes they forget this one. And some people, especially those that would work in the media outlets, would probably argue it might be the most important part. So what's it mean? What does this thing actually say? It says that we have a freedom of the press, but what does that actually mean? It means that we as Americans have the right to not just print and write, but to criticize our government. So we can print and write about them, but we also can say when they're doing a terrible job and when they're doing a fantastic job. And we can criticize them as a whole body, or we can criticize them as individuals. And just like the idea of media ownership being privately owned is rare, this is also pretty rare. In most places of the world, the idea that you could get on a television, get on the radio, get on the internet, get on a blog, and then of course, work for a newspaper and say that President Obama is a terrible president, just wouldn't happen in a place like North Korea and a place like China. In fact, because their media is owned by the government, they really obviously aren't in the business of criticizing themselves, and journalists who work, they're government employees, and they have to be extremely careful of how they write and what they write. And in fact, many of them have gotten out of the business because it's so fearful. They're just so afraid that they're going to get killed. Literally, in a place like North Korea and China, writing the wrong thing, using the wrong adjective and verb, could mean something like murder or jail. And it's illegal to criticize the government in those places. So when you're giving Miss Howell trouble for teaching you all of those things, just imagine if you worked in a place like North Korea or China, you would actually need to know the right verbs and adjectives to be using. Okay, we have freedom, but of course, we would think there has to be some kind of limit, right? They're not going to let us just say whatever we want, right? Well, kind of. There are legal, and when we're talking legal, we're talking freedom of action, certain things you can't do, right? Your actions, what you can do. And then there's obviously government policies which limit the actual access to the press. So yes, it's not freedom in the sense where you can kind of do whatever you want. Of course, there are limits to those things, and we'll talk about what they are. So first, let's talk a little bit about what those first checks look like. And probably the most important one libel. Is something called libel. Really interesting, mostly because it's libel is really interesting. So particularly because the word slander often used with libel. They are virtually the libel same thing, except one is spoken and it prevents something that we call slander, which is essentially what libel means verbally is that the press something bad about somebody that's not true. Libel is when you know willingly is going to ruin a person's really bad rumor, and then you print it in your favorite gossip magazine. My livelihood probably thinking, well, Miss DeSalvo, gossip magazines do that all the time. In other words, they can't print lies about you. What they usually do, and what us as readers don't often your reputation notice, is they can't say that so and so is a child molester. They use words like allegedly. They can only say that if they got some kind of evidence or source that indicates that would be true. If they just decide that they don't like Barack Obama and want to call him a child molester and make that up and print that source, and so it doesn't provide them to be, that would be something that legally he could take them to court for. Violation of the libel is interesting laws. Because you have to be able to prove it. So what libel actually really hard. It would be cannot write something that's going or threatens to ruin a person's reputation or livelihood. Something like you can't say something about someone that is going to destroy their business. You can't say something about someone that would tarnish their reputation. And when we're talking about politics in particular, that's like very important. You don't want to talk about and ruin someone's reputation.
Had a source that
would
worked
affect
in the
their
White House
political
that gave him this information.
achievements from
not only
then
does
on
he
out.
not have to give that source's
Also,
name
obscenity
up, but because
laws.
he said he had a source, they would do
you
some
cannot get naked on television. They're going to blur you out. Obviously, if you say the wrong things on TV, they're going to blur you out.
So
yes,
the press cannot
yes, can you say whatever you want? Yes, the press have freedom, of course, but there are limits within that.
So coupled with libel, legal checks, we're going to talk about obscenity.
Who controls it? Who's in charge of making sure that
on the Jimmy
those
Fallon show
obscenities,
and show up in the
those
audience
naked, that
and
language
they
kind of
cue
stuff
to you
doesn't
for whatever
happen.
reason, you're going to be blurred out. Your naked body is not going to be broadcast on television. Those of you that are thinking,
and then obviously
what about
language,
things like
right? You
porn?
can't
That's a
go
little
on
bit different because that's
just curse
a
away.
specific network
if
that
you
you're
do,
paying
they're
for,
going to
right?
bleep it out, etc. So
it's a different.
Obviously,
it's not public
part of
television.
obscenity
Usually
laws
have
has
to pay
to do
for
with
those
naked,
kinds of things. I know movies sometimes
figures,
have
and then the other part has to do with
again,
the
you're paying
language
for
that you use.
the Starz network. You're paying.
They don't
for
let
HBO,
you just have your free for all there. So yes, we have freedom of the press, but again, limits. So who controls these? Who's in charge of really regulating these agencies? So the thing that was created to be in charge of such things was called the Federal Communications Commission, otherwise known as the FCC. And it was created in 1934 particularly because of tech problems. There was a lot of, frequency when people would put their radios on, you would get the kind of noise. And so in order to deal with that, the static, all of that stuff, the constant dropping of radio channels, there was something called the FCC that was created. And basically what it is it's its own agency. It's an independent agency, and its job today is a little bit different than what it was in 1934. But today it regulates things between states, so interstate, that word from our previous unit, and then international communication, and it regulates it by radio, TV, telephone, telegraph, cable, and satellite. So what's their role? What's their main job? It's to do a bunch of things. First, administer rules. Make sure people aren't breaking obscenity laws. Make sure people aren't breaking libel or participating in libel acts. Make sure that monopolies aren't being created, right? We do have a private ownership, and yes, those are corporations, but there's 6 of them. It's not just one main corporation controlling all of our news. That's not okay in our country. To set technical standards. So today you have to have one of those HD converters. Even if you don't have cable TV, you have to go buy one of them at like a Radio Shack or something. That's because of the FCC. That was, set forth by them. That was, I think it was about 3-ish years ago. Also, every 5 years, they grant licenses to TV and radio stations. So those stations have to be following certain codes and not be in violation of anything. And if they do, they risk being fined and then again losing their license by the FCC. And then they make sure that broadcast standards are being held. So people are following these rules. They're adhering to all, the necessary things that need to happen. And it's a better viewing environment for me and for you. To couple with the FCC, there was something created around 1949, right at the end of the First World War, up until actually 1987, which, isn't that too long ago. It's about 27 years ago. Hint, hint. And it required different, the Fairness Doctrine required broadcasters basically to give fair opportunities for expression between opposing views on public issues. So if 2 candidates were talking about, I don't know, let's just say something like the war on drugs. Okay, each candidate was supposed to be given a fair amount of time and way to express themselves. By 1987, everyone kind of realized that this is sort of a silly rule. It actually, in a way, kind of restricts expression and the ability to really think freely. And so what they ended up doing was getting rid of it. And that's how the whole idea of narrowcasting was developed. Imagine the Bill O'Reilly show having to bring on liberals. All right, that wouldn't work. His whole point of his show is to be ultra conservative, to bring on people that
are like him, or to bring on people that aren't like him so that he can kind of berate them, right? You remember the clip I showed you where the two guys are arguing. Same thing with a Rachel Maddow. She's super liberal. She brings on super liberals to agree with her, or she brings on conservatives so that she can have a debate and an argument with them. And those shows wouldn't work if the fairness doctrine was still in place, because they would have to give equal time to both sides. So what they came up with instead was something today that they call equal time provision, and it applies only for political candidates. So if you're running for a political office, then this would apply to you, but if you're just like you and I, it wouldn't, which makes narrowcasting able to work. So equal time provision deals with when you're talking about selling advertising. And it has something else called the right to reply. So let's go back to selling advertising first. So basically, if a station sells ad time to Obama, they also need to sell it to Mitt Romney. So if CBS is willing to air a political ad approved by Barack Obama, then they also need to be willing to sell the same amount of air time and space, meaning giving opportunity for Mitt Romney's campaign to also purchase time and to purchase space in the air, the airwaves, in the broadcast world, so that when you and I turn on our TV, we get both people, which is why, particularly during, political election times, particularly during November when there's a presidential race happening, it seems like every other commercial is like that. That's why it happens. That's why you see so much of the back and forth. Right to reply comes next. And basically, it kind of hopefully will make sense. If one candidate is attacked on any kind of station other than the news, if, MTV, let's say, decides to say something really terrible about Mitt Romney is supposed to be given the chance to go on MTV and advocate for himself, defend himself. That's called the right to reply. Sometimes it's used, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really dangerous for candidates to do this, because if they go on one of these stations, one, they're facing people who already don't like them, and two, if they say the wrong thing, they can really put their foot in the mouth. So it's not necessarily always used, but it's there, it's put in place for them. So where does Congress come in here? How do they actually control the FCC? They provide them funding. So because Congress deals with the budget, they do provide the FCC funding, and they do obviously help to control and regulate laws. However, they can't regulate the content. So the U.S. Congress cannot say that South Park shouldn't be on the air. That's not up for them. That's up for the FCC. And federal law, as we know, prevents anybody from censoring. So that's why South Park, even though it's politically motivated and a little bit violent, and some people would argue pretty funny, but they say some kind of things that maybe you're thinking, but you wouldn't actually ever say out loud. That's why that show exists. That's why it can't be censored. Again, a place like China, a place like North Korea, not the case. It's the FCC's job, along with Congress, to make sure that those decency and obscenity standards are being held, making sure people don't, show inappropriate body parts on TV. A few years ago, you might remember the famous, what they called the nip slip, when Janet Jackson's costume at the Super Bowl kind of fell down and her breast was exposed. She got fined for that, but so did the Super Bowl. So did the NFL, who, even though it was kind of a freak accident, okay, they let the boob get shown on TV because they couldn't censor it out quick enough. So that's something that the FCC makes sure that they're following, because Congress does make sure that they're doing that, make sure that they're finding the right people, make sure that they're upholding the standards that they say they're going to. Last piece. Government policies on limits. So, of course, there are some government policies, certain things that are supposed to be secret for the government. Okay? The press cannot leak classified documents. Something that deals with something like the Warren Commission, when that was the report that was given after JFK was assassinated, okay? There was 20 years before that report could actually be presented to the public and leaked, if you will, or distributed to the public. That kind of thing has to be followed. There was a 9/11 commission. They had to wait a certain amount of time before that report would be released. So certain classified documents the government holds on to, they usually put some kind of time limit, and the press, even though they have the freedom to print and criticize the government, they don't have the the freedom to print secret classified documents as deemed by the U.S. government, whether it's from the president's office, whether it's from the White House staff, whether it's from the Senate or the House, whether it's from the FBI, the CIA. You get the gist. Second thing, the press does have limited access when it comes to military operations, okay? We can't have press members saying where our next troops are going. It puts the troops in danger, it puts the press people who follow those troops in danger, what they call press agents, and it actually puts your life and my life in danger. There's certain things that we just don't need to know because we entrust the military and the people that we elect to in positions of power to make those right choices for us. And so we don't want to know when they're doing a sneak attack on Osama bin Laden, because then it won't work. And if it doesn't work, we can't get somebody like that, to be killed and captured. So the press, yes, they have freedom, but we don't let them report about secret military operations, how Navy SEALs are trained, different things that occur in the military realm. Of course, that puts all of our lives, including the people in those positions who are fighting for our lives, in danger. We are protected, though. And that's the most interesting thing. We have this freedom of speech, we have this freedom of the press, we have the freedom of assembly. And yes, while there are limits, they're all kind of make sense, and they're all really within certain parameters for us. But then again, the Constitution puts forth more protections. So it's not just saying, hey, you can print what you want. It's saying, hey, not only can you print what we want, but we want to make sure things like prior restraint, things like censorship before something's printed doesn't happen. They can't make a law saying you can't print something XYZ. You can't print something like the Pentagon Papers. If you remember, that was the famous court case, the New York Times court case that we talked about that got Nixon in so much trouble, and then eventually ended up leading to Watergate. So yes, you cannot censor. That's not the government's responsibility. So you have freedom of the press, but you also are allowed to maintain the idea that censorship, they cannot make a law after or right before you've printed something saying it's against the law. So let's recap as we kind of really wrap up this unit, we conclude this unit. Let's make sure that we really have gotten some of the main points here. So first, the media has this tremendous power. It's this really kind of simplistic thing. It's something we read, it's something we hear, it's something we watch. But their power to set the political agenda, to make sure that we know what issues are important for us, what issues are important for our country, what issues we want our politicians to take notice of, okay? That's really what they do. That's their main role and function. It's not just to inform, it's to really set forth how we want our country to change. And maybe that wasn't the case in the 1800s, and maybe that wasn't even the case in the 1930s, but it certainly is the case in 2014. They help decide what kind of news is reported on. Is it hard or is it soft? Is it a mix between? Are there some days when, we just hear all hard news? Are there some days when there's not a whole ton to report and it's all soft news? They play a role in deciding how things are reported. This is probably, I think, maybe my the most interesting concept of all. How we hear it. Do we read it? Do we see it? Do we watch it? Is it a combination of both? Is it a podcast? Is it a blog? Is there an infographic with it? And then also, how they deliver their message. Are they being really persuasive? Are they being really factual and just giving us the evidence? Are they interviewing so that we hear it from, so to speak, the horse's mouth, right? In something like a Bill Clinton, right? We don't need to hear the reporter. We want to hear Bill. We want to hear what he has to say about the scandal that they're reporting about. So how they also tell the story is also extremely important in our understanding of why it's so important. And then lastly, they have this responsibility to keep themselves unbiased, to tell two sides of a story. Now, do they do that well? It's hard. It's harder than you think. It's hard for me to be unbiased. Sometimes one of you comes and tells me something and I like you and I want to help you. And even though I want to teach you a lesson, I also don't want to see something that you've done go to waste. I'm thinking of one of you yesterday who had done the work, just made a mistake of not handing it in. Do I penalize this kid because that's the lesson I'm supposed to teach? Or do I, give them a little bit of a break because they're a good kid? So bias is obviously really difficult and challenging to deal with. But of course, all right, when you're the media, that's what you have to do. That's your responsibility, to tell both sides of a story and to make sure it's really clear.